Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for a presentation of the REL Midwest Toolkit for Assessing Learning Changes. I'm Dr. Dominique Bradley. I'm a researcher and training facilitator for REL Midwest in the American Institutes for Research. I'll let my colleague, Dr. Burkhauser, introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Susan Burkhauser, and I'm also a researcher and training facilitator for REL Midwest and the American Institutes for Research.
This presentation and the Learning Changes Toolkit were supported by the Regional Educational Laboratory Midwest, or REL Midwest. REL Midwest is one of 10 regional educational laboratories funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. REL Midwest works in partnership with state and local education agencies to improve the educational outcomes for all children. They do this work by providing research, coaching, and dissemination. This toolkit for assessing learning changes was developed in collaboration with the Ohio Department of Education in the fall of 2020, shortly after the initial COVID-19 school closures. This toolkit provides a step-by-step guide for districts to assess student learning changes, learn more about the experiences and needs of students, families, and staff, understand how to use this knowledge generated from the analyses to inform decision-making, and finally to identify next steps in addressing needs. This toolkit is useful for practitioners as it can be used at the school or district level to assess student learning changes quantitatively. It can also be used at the classroom level to qualitatively understand student needs and experiences. And finally, to develop an overall better understanding of what topic areas students most need learning supports in, such as reading or language arts, and which students are most in need of learning supports. The toolkit offers guidance on conducting quantitative and qualitative analyses. The quantitative analyses use existing student data to identify differential learning changes, allowing the user to tell who needs the additional learning supports most and in what subject areas. Qualitative data collection and analysis helps the user better understand the needs and experiences of students, families, and staff. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Burkhauser, to describe the elements of the toolkit and their uses.
Thank you, Dominique. As Dominique mentioned, I'll now talk about how to use the toolkit. The toolkit contains 5 modules, each designed to walk users through a set of steps needed for analysis, data collection, and planning for next steps. It also includes workbooks, conversation guides, and decision trees to help users through the process of assessing learning changes using quantitative or qualitative approaches. Modules 1 through 3 are designed for use by districts with the appropriate research questions, data, and capacity to conduct a quantitative analysis of COVID-19 learning changes. Each module walks districts through crucial decision points prior to conducting a quantitative analysis. In Module 1, the toolkit helps the user to identify and refine important questions about learning changes. In Module 2, the toolkit helps the users to identify and assess the use of existing student data. In Module 3, the toolkit walks the user through conducting different types of quantitative analyses. And we've provided an example at the right of what a finished product of this kind of analysis might look like. Module 4 outlines considerations for new data collection activities, and these might include surveys, interviews, or focus groups. It can be used as an independent module or as a complement for districts that have completed modules 1 through 3. Module 4 focuses on qualitative analyses, and these types of analyses can add context to quantitative analyses of COVID-19 related learning changes. For example, a district may want to know why certain groups of students experience larger or smaller learning changes in reading than the average student. These analyses can also help to provide needed information to districts that's not available in administrative data. For example, a district may want to know more about how students experienced remote instruction in reading in spring 2020. In addition, these analyses can provide a fundamental understanding of the needs of district students, families, and staff going into the 2021-2022 school year. For example, how many families are experiencing housing or food insecurities? Module 5 is intended to be used by all districts as a last step in their investigation into COVID-19 learning changes. The content of this module aids the user in creating a plan for disseminating findings, identifying new or additional questions about learning changes, seeking additional resources, and developing a plan for addressing student needs. Finally, we wanted to direct you to additional resources from the Institute of Education Sciences and resources from REL Midwest. You can also find this toolkit, as well as a recorded training webinar with detailed instructions on how to use the toolkit on the REL Midwest website.
Hello, my name is Lauren Amos. I'm a senior researcher at Mathematica. I'm pleased to have this chance to share several What Works Clearinghouse resources with you to support remote literacy instruction for elementary and secondary school students. The WWC is an initiative of the Institute of Education Sciences within the U.S. Department of Education. The WWC reviews education research to identify well-designed and well-implemented research, then summarizes findings from that high-quality research. The goal is to help educators and decision makers identify and implement evidence-based practices. To learn more about what the WWC does and the types of free resources available to educators that the WWC has to offer, I encourage you to attend our session on improving reading instruction for struggling readers. I'll begin by sharing 3 evidence-based tips for supporting remote reading instruction in the elementary grades. The tips shared in this resource come from 3 WWC practice guides on effective reading interventions for elementary school students. WWC practice guides are developed by a panel of nationally recognized experts and educators. Practice guide recommendations have strong evidence, meaning that there is consistent evidence that the recommended practices improve student outcomes for a diverse population of students. This resource was developed in 2020 to highlight evidence-based instructional strategies from these practice guides that could be implemented effectively in virtual learning environments. As schools shift back to in-person or hybrid learning, it's important to note that these tips can work well in both distance learning settings and more traditional classroom settings. These tips can also be implemented by classroom educators for free or at low cost by making small instructional adaptations. The complete resource is available for free on the WWC website. To help students develop awareness of segments of sound and speech and how they link to letters, the first tip is to hold visual representations of a letter or letters that represent a phoneme up to the camera or share electronic slides. A phoneme is the smallest unit of a sound in a word. For example, in a virtual setting, a teacher could hold visual representations of a letter or letters that represent a phoneme up to a camera or share electronic slides. This tip is appropriate for kindergarten through 3rd grade. To help students learn how to use reading comprehension strategies independently, the second tip is to gradually shift responsibility from teacher-led reading tasks to student-led tasks. This involves a teacher first explaining and modeling how to use a reading strategy, such as activating prior knowledge, and then giving students more independence in practicing and applying the strategy. Readers activate prior knowledge when they use what they already know to hypothesize or predict what will happen next in a text. For example, after modeling the use of prior knowledge, students can work in small groups to make predictions about the plot of a story based on their prior knowledge. Next, the teacher can guide students through a reading task, step by step, that requires them to make hypotheses about a character. Lastly, a student can complete a reading task independently that involves activating prior knowledge. This tip is also appropriate for kindergarten through 3rd grade. The third tip is to support English learners by integrating oral and written English language instruction into content area lessons. Teachers can help students for a lesson in any can prepare students for a lesson in any content area by using instructional aids such as engaging short videos or visual organizers. For example, to focus students' attention on the most relevant content for a lesson on the civil rights movement, A teacher can pre-teach key words or phrases such as boycott and share a list of questions that students should be prepared to answer after viewing a video on Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. This tip is appropriate for the elementary and middle school grades. Next, I'll share 4 evidence-based tips for supporting remote writing instruction in the elementary and secondary grades. These tips can be implemented by classroom teachers for free or at a low cost by making small instructional adaptations. These tips come from 2 WWC resources that summarize recommendations from 4 different practice guides on effective writing instruction at the elementary and secondary school age. The complete resources are available for free on the WWC website. These resources were also developed in 2020 to highlight evidence-based instructional strategies from these practice guides that could be implemented effectively in virtual learning environments. As with the previous resources I shared, these tips can work well in both distance learning settings and more traditional classroom settings. To help students, including English learners, develop writing skills, the first tip is to create structured opportunities for practice. Teachers can use a consistent set of writing routines to not only guide students through the writing process, but also help them develop academic vocabulary and an understanding of grammatical conventions. Graphic organizers, such as a compare-contrast organizer, can help students organize their thinking. This tip is appropriate for the elementary and middle grades. To help students use the writing process for a variety of purposes, the second tip is to expose them to exemplary models of what students will be asked to write. Teachers should first select text from a range of sources, such as their own writing and student writing samples. Teachers should also select texts that support the lesson's learning objectives, are developmentally appropriate, and reflect students' interests. Exemplary texts can illustrate text structure, use of graphics, effective word choice, varied sentence structure, and other features of effective writing that students can apply to their own writing. This tip is also appropriate for the elementary and middle grades. To help students develop written language skills, create regular and structured opportunities for students, including English learners, to participate in critical conversations about text with their peers. Teachers can use virtual breakout rooms, included in most remote learning software platforms, to allow students to collaboratively brainstorm, prepare for writing by completing a graphic organizer, or provide feedback on each other's work. Teachers should model and guide students in how to provide constructive feedback to peers. This tip is appropriate for secondary school students. To help students internalize the features of effective writing, explicitly teach writing strategies using the model, practice, reflect process. This process is also referred to as I do, we do, you do. This process involves the teacher first modeling a writing strategy or task, such as developing a plot diagram. Second, students practice that same strategy with support from the teacher or peers. Third, students practice the strategy on their own and evaluate how well they perform the task. This final tip is also appropriate for secondary school students. Thank you for your interest in the tips for supporting writing instruction remotely. I encourage you to reach out to the WWC Help Desk with any questions. This resource and the other practice guides and resources that I mentioned, and lots of other great evidence-based resources related to literacy are available to the public for free on the WWC website. Thank you.